The chair this evening is Mr. Aziz Pahad. Mr. Aziz Pahad was born in 1940. He completed his bachelor's degree at Wits University in 1963. Banned under the Suppression of Communism Act 1963, he went into exile in 1964. In 1966, he obtained a diploma in international relations from University College London and a master's degree of international relations from Sussex University in 1968, both in England. In 1985, he was elected to the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, a position he held until 2007. In 1993, Mr. Pahad represented the ANC in the Transitional Executive Council Subcommittee on International Relations. Between 1994 to 2008, he was the Deputy Foreign Minister. He was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Africa. And in 2014 to 2016, a presidential envoy. Presently, he is the chair of the South Africa Council of International Affairs. Mr. Pahad is a recipient of 3 Umkhonto weSizwe medals. Over to you, Mr. Pahad.
Thank you. That sounds like fake news. But let me say how thrilled I was when Professor Adebajo asked me to chair this book launch organized by, as it said, University of Johannesburg Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation in collaboration with the UJ Library. In the book Waiting in the Wings, the author Carien du Plessis, in less than 150 pages, has captured the life of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Very little, indeed, has been written about her. In this short book, From a Youth to the Past 1994 period, in this challenging time, Dlamini Zuma served under 4 presidents as Minister of Health, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Home Affairs, and later became chairperson of the AU Commission. I was very privileged that I was able to serve under her ministership as a deputy minister for several years. After her stint at the AU, she returned to South Africa to contest for the presidency of the ANC and South Africa. Well, her waiting in the wings is over. As we all know, she lost the presidential elections narrowly to President Ramaphosa, and today is the minister in the presidency dealing with planning, monitoring, and evaluation. It is a great pleasure to welcome the author Carien du Plessis, who is a freelance journalist focusing on African and in particular South African politics. For the past decade and a half, she has reported mainly on South African and some African politics for the Daily Maverick. I hope all of you read the Daily Maverick. It's free. Sometimes I get very confused by it, but I think we have to read it. It's one of those informed sources type of journal, production. And she's also worked with the independent newspaper and Media 24's Afrikaans titles, and she also contributed political analysis for radio and television shows and done investigative stories. As I said, she's covered some of the most challenging times, post-94, in foreign affairs, in the health sector, and indeed in home affairs. And it'll be fascinating to listen to Carien giving us a more detailed explanation of the areas she's covered in the book, Waiting in the Wings. Carien.
Thank you very much to Aziz Bahad for that lovely introduction. I think he's actually, as a politician, he's more used to talking. As a journalist, I like listening more. So I'm kind of tempted to tell him just to continue talking, and to continue telling everything about his adventures, because I think he's had many in the ministry. But yeah, I mean, I think I'll tell you a little bit more about why I wrote the book. It seems a bit moot now because the battle is over. When I decided to write this book, it's about a year ago that I actually decided to write this book and pitch the idea to Penguin. So, the time was very different then. It feels like a lifetime away, everything that happened in the past year in the ANC's battle. But still, I mean, it seems in South Africa is divided between two kinds of people: those who know Dlamini Zuma well and those who know very little or nothing about her. And similarly, there are those who love her or those who hate her, and very, very few in between. And yeah, that fascinated me. That why do people, they either say really glowing things about her or they say really, really bad things about her? And I was trying to sort of see who is the woman. She's very enigmatic. So she didn't make it to the ANC's presidency, so it's no use on speculating anymore what kind of a president she would be. The idea of the book was to see what kind of president she would make if she were to win in Nasrec. But I'll tell you a little bit about the writing of the book, why I did it, what I really think happened at Nasrec, and I think a lot of those things will come out in the next few months still, in the next few years. And also, now that the reshuffle's been done, I will sort of look at what I think she will do in her new ministry in the presidency, where she's in charge of planning, monitoring, and evaluation. It's a very big portfolio. So so by the time that I decided to write the book, it was in February. I was in Cape Town for the State of the Nation address, and a colleague said we should have coffee, and she suggested over coffee, she said, "Oh, I know these people at Penguin, they're always looking for political titles," and she said, "Why don't I suggest a book about Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma?" Because she knew I'd been to the AU summits in the past few years. I'd been there a lot. I'd observed her working, and it was a topic that interested me. So I kind of decided, what the hell, I'll write to Penguin, I'll write to the editor. They pitched the idea just for the heck of it, and they loved it, and they said, "Okay, you've got 3 months to write this book," which I don't know how many people have written books, but and I didn't know at the time, but it was very little time. So it was a fast book. And the idea was to write a short book with just to see, what kind of a person she is, just to explain what her life is like. To write a full-blown biography, I think Mark Visser took 8 years to write his book about Thabo Mbeki, and I now know why. I think it would be nice, actually, to follow up this book with a more in-depth look at her life, because she's still a little bit of an enigma to me. So yes, my reason for writing the book was twofold. Let's put this thing a bit lower. It wasn't an authorized biography. It's not something, she didn't approach me to do the book. Some people thought that it was authorized, it was done with her cooperation. In fact, she didn't want me to interview her for the book at all, so she didn't cooperate at all. And also, as a political journalist, I felt I needed to balance the book as much as possible. I didn't want to be seen to be campaigning for her or decampaigning her, because I need to remain not objective, but kind of impartial, kind of consider all the sides. And I didn't want to lose my credibility, as happened to some journalists in the Zuma campaign. But I won't elaborate about that. So she didn't grant me an interview, and very few people, it was a very difficult book to do, because by the time I decided to do it, the ANC's battle was heating up. People didn't want to talk to me. They were scared to be seeing to be campaigning for her or to be campaigning against her. It was such a charged atmosphere. And I'm sure you can remember, a lot of you will remember how charged it was in the media, in debates and everything, and on Twitter especially. And also some people didn't even want to talk off the record. It was that charged. I don't know if they were scared of Mdluli tapping their phones. I'm not sure who's tapping our phones now that Ramaphosa's in charge, but we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, and also another reason, so the reason why I wrote the book was I'm very interested in women in power. I consider myself to be a feminist. I really want to see more women in power in the presidency. I really think we have too many men in power in South Africa, even where, even though we've got the gender equality, 50-50 ratios, very few women have real power here. So that was interesting to me to kind of speculate what she would be like as a woman president, how she would be different from a male president. And also there was a lot of sexism, I think, in the campaign around the way people talk about, the way people spoke about her, the way people talk about women in power. So I wanted to try and kind of see through that, work through that as well. And I was curious to see if she would do better or worse than a man. And it's unfortunately we won't know now, but it was interesting to think about and to speculate. And one thing that I did think, without sort of seeming to be choosing sides, I'm very happy about the outcome in Nasrec, but I would have been equally happy to see a woman president, to see perhaps. During the Zuma era, there was so much scandal, there was so much sexual scandal, and even Ramaphosa had his own sexual scandals. And looking at her, there was not that kind of sleaze around her, and that would have been quite liberating in a way to have had a president with much less sleaze than we're seeing, or than we've seen in politics up to now. And yeah, admittedly, she would have been, I thought if she became president, the State of the Nation address would have been really, really dull. She's not an inspiring speaker. She's not, so that would have been different. But yeah. And another reason why I wrote the book was that I realized very few people knew who she is. Because we have very short memories in South Africa. At the pace at which news is going now, it's very hard to remember what we did yesterday. But a lot of people forgot what she did, or we sort of moved on, or perhaps the Zuma years were very traumatizing, so we have kind of amnesia. But also in journalism, I realized a lot of colleagues are very young. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma left the country in 2012 to go to the AU, to be AU Commission Chair. And a lot of people reporting on politics only started reporting after that. So I had lots of colleagues coming to me and saying, well, we never worked with her. We never saw her in action as a minister. What was she like? So I thought that it was interesting to try and fill that gap as well for people who never worked with her or never knew her, and also very few journalists actually went to the AU. We were lucky. I resigned from City Press in 2015. I was working there doing politics full time, and I resigned from that to actually try and do more continental politics and go and travel a bit more, because there's very limited opportunities in the media. So I was lucky I could go to every AU summit, and every time we went to the summit, contrary to what she was like in the ANC campaign, she spoke to us. After every summit, she gathered the South African journalists. She gave us 30 minutes to an hour, and we sat there and we spoke to her and we asked her what we wanted to ask her. So in that sense, it was, I was very privileged to have interacted with her, and I wanted to share that experience in a book as well, and the insights that we gained there. In the past year, she gave very few media interviews, so she's still an enigma to many people. Journalists, it's very, very frustrating to try and get anything out of her. The only times that she was really nice was when she was out of the city. I remember when Sindiso Magaqa, when he died, when he was last year, she went to his house, and I guess it was also a very different circumstance, and we went there, and she spoke to us, and that's the only time that I really remember her speaking to us and being that nice and relaxed. But for the rest of the time, it was difficult to get access to her. So yeah, I want to read you an excerpt from the book about just kind of my speculation about what happened at Nasrec, what happened that she, when she lost to Cyril Ramaphosa. So I want to read about, it's on page 119, the bit about the lobby group named the Premier League, which manifested in an interesting way in politics recently, but we won't talk about David Mabuza now. So the Premier League comprised three premiers, Ace Magashule, David Mabuza, and Suprema Umapelo from the Northwest. All three were supporters of Jacob Zuma. And David Mabuza, this is a little bit old now, but David Mabuza he was never really 100% behind Jacob Zuma, but in the end it seemed like he was going, or behind Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, but in the end it seemed like he was going with her. But I'll tell you just now why I thought he didn't. In the months leading up to the conference, branch members said there were directives and material incentives offered to delegates willing to vote for Dlamini Zuma. She was highly supportive of Zuma as well during this time. Of course, the three premiers denied campaigning for her. A few months later, the ANC Youth League elective conference followed a similar pattern where the Premier League campaigned for Colin Maine there. And I'm just trying to see. So soon, the three premiers were singing her praises after the Women's League nominated Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as their candidate. And equally quickly came accusations that she was a mere front for the interests of these men, and for Zuma in particular. It came down to the question, how much of her own woman was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma? And with so much of her life, the conclusion proved elusive. So it was hard ever to tell when people were campaigning for her, was she her own woman? Was she just using them for her campaign? And as you'll remember, David Mabuza, the former Mpumalanga Premier, now Deputy President, he was on her slate to be Deputy President. And at the last minute, I think it was overnight basically, he swung and he went with Cyril Ramaphosa. And the reason for that, in my view, was because in 2010, when she was Minister of Home Affairs, there was a contract that for a project called Who Am I Online, and it had to do with getting, I think, identification, getting people registered online ahead of the Soccer World Cup in 2010. And Robert Gumede, a very close friend of David Mabuza, had that contract. And then for some reason he didn't deliver. It was a 2 billion rand contract, and she cancelled the contract and gave it to SARS, who did it in 6 weeks. I think 6 weeks or something for a few million rand. I don't even think it was for 10 million rand. And word is that Robert Gumede never forgave her for that. And so he kind of rode along on her slate, but in the end he swung against her. There's also some people who said it's just mere patriarchy. It's that these men didn't really want to see a woman in power. I don't want to sort of think about conspiracy theories. I really hope it's not true, but that was the other theory. So but I think there will be more details about what happened at Nasrec as the wounds sort of heal and things die down a bit. And so her relationship with Zuma himself, with Jacob Zuma, was also, there was lots of speculation around it. How close was she to him? Was she going to be his proxy in power when she gets to the presidency? And for me, I mean, that was very important to the book. But in a way, as a political journalist, I feel very uncomfortable probing into people's private lives, contrary to popular belief. We're not all paparazzi. So for me, and also the sense when I managed to find out how things were, or what I think, or what people were saying things were like, then I thought, well, how much of this should I write? How much of it is relevant? And in a sense, I mean, now that I look back at it and the way that she accepted the ministry, the way she reconciled with Cyril Ramaphosa, I'm convinced that she was her own woman and that she was using him as a campaign vehicle. I think it was ill-judged because I don't think Zuma and even Dlamini Zuma realized how tired people were of the former president. So, yeah, so that was an interesting question. But I want to read you another bit from the book. Yeah, I'll just discuss this with what happened before it. In 2012, soon after the Mangaung conference, there was a business breakfast. I think it was by ANN7 when things were still going very well there. It was a business breakfast where they introduced the ANC's top six, and I was there. The room was really packed, and then after the breakfast, Zuma got Dlamini Zuma to get up. She was just elected to the AU Commission. It was December 2012. She was just elected to the AU Commission as the chair then, and she got the most votes at that conference. She was the most popular candidate in Mangaung. She even got more votes than Zuma himself. So he made her get up, and he kind of hinted that she would be the next president, and she looked uncomfortable. I mean, it was difficult to say. When she does look uncomfortable, it's difficult to say whether she really is uncomfortable or whether it's just her style. But to me, she looked uncomfortable. And to me, I perceive Zuma to be a little bit patronizing. So all through her campaign, she's tried to distance herself. But it hasn't been that easy. She might be divorced from Zuma, but in a traditionalist society, such as the Zulu society, once a man and a woman are married, the bond is permanent, especially when there are children. So when Zuma sat by her side in the front row of a Thanksgiving service at the St. Catherine's Roman Catholic Church congregation, that's her home congregation in Bulwer in KwaZulu-Natal, this suggested intimacy to the congregation. After all, the church was in Dlamini Zuma's hometown. When Zuma spoke warmly of her and stressed their close connection by saying, "I know her personally, she's not just a comrade," the innuendo was very plain to some. With a wink, one of the congregants interpreted Zuma's remark as sexually suggestive, and it played into gossip that they still shared a bed. And you'll remember there were some stories around the fact that they might still be together or living together in Kandla. So the irony was that while endorsement from her former husband was politically advantageous in some circles, such as the conservative provinces of the Northwest and the Free State, the Premier League provinces, where the idea of a female president was anathema, association with Zuma was also toxic. Repeatedly in her campaigning, she told supporters, "I am my own woman and I've worked hard to be here," or "No amount of patriarchy will stop me from serving my people." Or, as she told a crowd in Ikopo near her home base, "We must not allow people to say you're so-and-so's lover. A comrade is a comrade." So that struggle to separate herself from her husband, to distance herself, while at the same time being on his campaign vehicle, it was a very interesting one to observe. And I think a lot of people will probably never forgive her for being so closely associated to him during her campaign. So ultimately, maybe she underestimated how gatful people were with Zuma. It wasn't just a rejection of her, the vote against her in Nasrec. It was also a rejection of her ex-husband because they were seen to be close. I was there in Parliament when they... Oh, how? Oh, I'm talking as much as a politician here now, sorry. In Parliament, I was there in Parliament, gosh, was it 2 weeks ago? It was just after Valentine's Day, on the 15th of February. I was there when the National Assembly elected Cyril Ramaphosa to be president, and the feeling in Parliament, it was like everyone was in love. Everyone was so relieved to be rid of Zuma. The MPs, I'm talking about the ANC MPs. I was looking at the caucus there. Everyone was so happy that he was gone. Yet only a few months ago, they were defending him tooth and nail. So I think she perhaps really underestimated how gatful people were. And I realized that in Parliament. Yeah. So, and I couldn't help thinking what it would have been like if it was Dlamini Zuma who was elected in Parliament on the 15th. If it was her that they would have elected, would there have been that same feeling? Would people still feel that they were saddled with a Zuma burden? And also the anti-corruption. Ramaphosa's campaign was very much anti-corruption. I mean, we can talk about this more perhaps in a discussion. Her campaign, she didn't really, normally when she spoke about corruption, there was only one line. Most of it was radical economic transformation. It was about development policies. And I sometimes got the idea that she thought corruption is part of a developmental, fighting corruption is part of a developmental program. It shouldn't be the main campaign theme. So I think it would have been an interesting, different emphasis on the presidency if she became president. And perhaps also with the corruption thing, the Robert Gumede episode perhaps made her realize that you can really make permanent enemies in politics if you cross someone in the wrong way. And just briefly, what kind of a minister would she be? I think she's a bureaucrat. I think that's a very good fit. The minister in the presidency, responsible for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Jeff Radebe was that before, also not a very inspiring speaker, but someone who's solid on policy. So I think it would be interesting to see also what she makes of the position. It can be a very powerful position. It has been a little bit, I think after the death of Collins Chibane, not much has been happening in that ministry. He was responsible for the monitoring and evaluation part. So it would be interesting to see if she makes something of it. And I just want to read a little bit. It's in the first chapter in the introduction of the book about her, if I can just find where I wrote it, is that how aware she was of the Nkandla scandal. For instance, she's building a new house next to her current one on a hill in her home township of Nkumba. This was a year ago. I was there in May, and I saw this house being built in Nkumba, in KwaZulu-Natal. I was told it's a retirement home, by the way. I'm not sure if she's going to use it now that she's minister, but so she's building this house. There are rolling hills, forests, lake, and in winter, snow on the peaks of the Drakensberg mountain that form the Lesotho border. Her childhood home was higher up on the hill, but that was destroyed by a boulder that crashed down on the hillside in the late 1960s. Today, a thorn tree and a boulder mark the spot where she once lived. Her home is modest. This is her retirement home that she's building, is modest. It does not look like the house of someone who has held cabinet positions and was the chair of the AU Commission. I don't want another Nkandla, she told her neighbors when she showed them her plans for the new house. Perhaps this is why she started building while she was not in public office in South Africa and before she could be accused of dipping into the public purse. So I mean, when I wrote this, I was kind of thinking maybe she would be president. But this retirement home that she's building, I think it's very clear that she realized what damage corruption or perceived corruption has done to South Africa, and hopefully as a minister she will form part of Ramaphosa's campaign and the effort to clean up, to make ministers accountable. So it will be interesting. Perhaps watch the space.
Thanks, Carien. I think you're a potential politician. And thanks, you've thrown a lot of new ideas that I'm sure the participants are going to pick up. Well, let me not spend too much of time and say the discussion for today is Professor Adebajo, who is the director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at UJ. He's got a very distinguished career. Over the years, he has given us a lot of headaches. He served on United Nations missions in South Africa, Western Sahara and Iraq, and is the author of 6 books, including The Curse of Berlin, Africa and After the Cold War, Thabo Mbeki, Africa's Philosopher King, and The Eagle and the Springbok, Essays on Nigeria and South Africa. He is co-editor or editor of 9 books. His latest book, which will be released in April, is South Africa's Foreign Policy After 1994. It will be another interesting book to see how foreign policy of that period is being analyzed and debated. He obtained his doctorate from Oxford University in England, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. It is generally accepted that Professor Adebajo is an outstanding scholar and an international activist who does not fear debate and controversy. He loves controversy. And he has organized many seminars and workshops where there has been robust intellectual debate and sharp differences. Unlike many other events where I must say something's new to me, academics, when they differ, there's serious confrontations. I must say, under his watch in Cape Town, under the Center for, what was it, the Center for Conflict Resolution, we had many sharp differences, but there were no confrontation. So let me welcome Professor Adebayo to respond to Carrie's book and her input.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, for the very warm introduction. And many of you will know that Aziz Pahad, very modest, is, I think, the longest serving Deputy Foreign Minister in the world. He was there from 94 to 2008, and throughout the whole period of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, so he was a particularly appropriate chair. We have with us today the Kenyan ambassador, the Algerian ambassador who served in Addis Ababa with Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the deputy head of the Dutch embassy. We have colleagues from Switzerland, from the US. So we have a lot of diplomatic firepower as well as our own community. So we hope that we'll be able to have a lively debate. And as Aziz Pahad has said, the whole idea is not to agree with each other, but to actually have a difference of view that the audience can then hopefully mediate in some ways or make their own decisions. So this is a journalist book, I think, rather than an academic biography. It doesn't pretend to be anything different. At 144 pages, it's succinct and readable, so it's a quick read. It provides some interesting insights into the life and times of the 69-year-old Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who held 3 high-profile ministerial positions under Mandela, Mbeki, Motlanthe, and Zuma, and has now surprisingly, for me, returned as a minister in the presidency under Cyril Ramaphosa. I divide my review into 4 parts, examining first the kind of formative experiences which are covered in the book, then assessing her ministerial position, analyzing her chairing of the AU, which actually forms the bulk of the book. So I was a little bit surprised that Carien didn't spend much time on the AU period, which I'll try to spend a bit more time on, but I guess you're judging your audience as more interested in the domestic issues. And then I'll conclude with some reflections on her career. The ANC presidential campaign in 2017 was Dlamini Zuma's to lose, and she contrived to lose it. She misread the dramatic changes that had taken place in South Africa's political landscape since she went to Addis in 2012, and was clearly too close to her deeply unpopular ex-husband, as Carien has also noted. Though a political misjudgment, Dlamini Zuma did have a track record in her own right at home and abroad. And so Justice Malala's comment, which Carien quoted in her book, that Dlamini Zuma was, and I quote, no different from Jacob Zuma. She is Jacob Zuma in a duke, is therefore clearly sexist, denying Nkosazana her own identity and record. Dlamini Zuma, however, was sometimes her own worst enemy on the hustings and will remember when she was being challenged by the media for having this protection service without being a cabinet minister or a parliamentarian. And she just refused to answer any questions, which seemed to suggest that, a lack of accountability and a sense of entitlement. This book is particularly strong at explaining these dynamics. The author, however, surprisingly, although she did it just now, does not explore the misogyny among voters that keep out women, strong women like Dlamini Zuma and Hillary Clinton from office. How can the ANC continue to claim a non-sexist tradition when only one of its top 6 are women, and when men continue to monopolize the most important cabinet positions, as we've seen with the recent reshuffle? These are questions that we need to tackle. Dlamini Zuma's time as chair of the AU Commission in Addis is at the heart of this book. I think probably around 80 to 90% of the book actually covers her time at the AU. But these sections, for me, failed to provide a real sense of Dlamini Zuma's 4-year tenure, which would require a clearer understanding of how the AU itself works as an institution. In writing the book, the author noted the failure of many of Dlamini Zuma's associates to talk to her, which we just heard. But I think she could have done much better in using AU sources, with many of those quoted being mainly South African analysts, many with no sound record on either African nor AU issues. There's also a parochial over-reliance on South African media like The Star, Business Day, City Press, Cape Times, which have scarcely been renowned for their coverage of continental issues as well. The book's early chapters reveal interesting insights into Nkosazana's childhood and ideological awakening. Carien draws out well the paradoxes of her subject, and I particularly liked when she made the comparisons of a woman with rural roots leading a continental body, a gender activist being married to a polygamist, a popular leader with an unsmiling lack of charisma. The author also shows the deep influence on Dlamini Zuma of her school teacher father and homemaker mother. And at Adams College, she develops her political awakening. She wanted to be a lawyer. I found this interesting, but actually acceded to her father's wish that she study medicine. She became vice president of the South African Students' Organization before going into exile in Swaziland. And what I also found interesting in the background that Carien sketched out is that she was steeped at first in Black consciousness rather than the ANC's non-racist ideologies. And she envisioned a radical restructuring of a capitalist imperialist economy before settling into more mainstream ANC policies. And as a minister, she didn't really show any of this youthful radicalism that we saw. So it was rather unconvincing when in 2017 on the hustings, she started talking about radical economic transformation. Nkosazana completed her medical studies at Bristol University in England, where she also headed the ANC's youth section before returning to Swaziland. We're told that she married Jacob Zuma in 1982. He was already married to 2 other women by that time, but the book disappointingly does not provide any details of the courtship. I would have liked to have seen a bit more tittle-tattle in terms of how Jacob Zuma actually courted our subject. Though we are told, interestingly, that the bride price was 11 head of cattle. As Mandela's health minister between 1994 and 1999, Dlamini Zuma was often portrayed as a Godzuma. That was her nickname with the press. Kind of unsmiling, arrogant, and brusque. She, however, delivered free health care for poor pregnant women and children, faced down the tobacco lobby making sure that smoking was banned in public places. And she brought in Cuban doctors in a show of solidarity with a country that had been critical to South Africa's own liberation. And she also fought pharmaceutical companies as well. But she did become embroiled in scandals. Sarafina too, where 14 million rand was squandered on an anti-AIDS play, and Virodine scandal, where there was an insolvent that had been, a toxic industrial solvent that was being touted by academics at the University of Pretoria as an anti-AIDS cure, potentially. As foreign minister between 1999 and 2009, with Aziz Pahad as her deputy, the book shows an active Dlamini Zuma in such theaters as Zimbabwe and DRC. The author talks of a brusque and abrasive management style. However, in my opinion, she exaggerates Dlamini Zuma's influence in the DRC peace process, which President Thabo Mbeki actually personally mediated himself. He also led the Zimbabwe peace process personally rather than delegated it. And even though the author criticizes her for promoting quiet diplomacy, this was in fact both ANC and government policy. I think it's important to note that Mbeki was in a sense effectively his own foreign minister. Aziz can either deny or confirm that. And on many key issues. And Dlamini Zuma was an implementer of policy. Mbeki, of course, had been head of the ANC's foreign policy section in exile and was very involved and interested in foreign policy, having also served in Nigeria and Zambia and Swaziland. The author is on more solid ground in criticizing Dlamini Zuma's blocking of the visit of the Dalai Lama in 2009. As Home Affairs Minister between 2009 and 2012, the author praises Dlamini Zuma's energy, efficiency, and empathy. In a repeat of her South-South solidarity in the health ministry, Cuban immigration experts were recruited to help train local officials. Unlike many other senior South African government officials, the Western-trained Dlamini Zuma did not automatically turn to the West for models for South Africa, which I think is something that is quite unique to her. The meat of the book on the AU Commission is in some ways a little bit disappointing for me, given the kind of factual and detailed information that we got on some of the early parts of the domestic minister. The author shows how Dlamini Zuma was effectively deployed to the AU in order to exile one of the party's most popular leaders, breaking in the process the OAU-AU's unwritten rules of no big country occupying that position. And Carien quotes a South African diplomat responding to this and saying, well, if the rule is unwritten, then it's not a rule. The book's failure to understand the AU effectively as an institution is demonstrated in the blaming of Gabonese AU Commission Chair Jean Ping for failures on Côte d'Ivoire, Libya, and Egypt, rather than, in my view, examining the complex local, regional, and global power politics within an AU that has always been notoriously head of state driven. So like the chief executive officer of the United Nations, the heads of states have always wanted more of a secretary than a general. And one has to understand that in measuring and assessing Dlamini Zuma's performance. The author's frequent criticisms of what she sees as an anachronistic South African anti-Western liberation movement mentality shows again for me a failure to understand the widespread perception of South Africa as a Western Trojan horse in Africa due to its white-dominated economy, academy, and civil society sector. I think the government tends often to be more sensitive about that than do many South African academic analysts. Her criticism of Dlamini Zuma's finding the French unnecessarily meddlesome also shows a lack of understanding of the pyromaniac fireman role that France has traditionally played in African theaters from Togo to DRC to Chad to Central African Republic and continues to play today in the Sahel, as well as its well-documented shameful actions during the Rwandan genocide of 1994. The author does not go into much detail on the most persistent criticism of Dlamini Zuma's tenure, that she used too many South African advisors in the office. She captures well, though, Dlamini Zuma's championing of gender issues, which was her most consistent policy during her 4-year reign. But I think blaming Dlamini Zuma for not doing more to halt conflicts in South Sudan, in Burundi, in Mali, in CAR, again demonstrates the lack of understanding of the domestic, global, and regional dynamics that often have more to do with whether conflicts are stopped or not, plus the fact that, as I said, it's the AU that tends to dominate decision-making within the AU. The book also fails, in my view, to give more credit to Dlamini Zuma's leading the suspension of Egypt from the AU after a military coup in 2013. It took real political courage to push for the suspension of a country that was one of 5 largest assessed contributors to the annual AU budget. And Carien quotes approvingly the completely over-the-top and highly personalized trenchant critic of Nigerian human rights activist Chidi Odunkalu that Dlamini Zuma's rule had actually enabled autocracy to spread on the continent. This is, of course, a totally jaundiced and misguided view, more shrill soundbite than solid social science. The book is finally too kind to Dlamini Zuma's Agenda 2063, which was drawn up and unveiled in 2013. And she sees the quixotic plan to develop and modernize Africa as the continent's first ever implementation plan for 5 decades. Well, the problem of a 50-year plan, of course, is that many of its architects will be dead and can't be held accountable for its failure. So it's not really like the cleverest thing to do. And I think more than any other initiative, this plan symbolized the alchemy at the heart of the AU Commission. It was a triumph of hope over experience. Among its euphoric ideas included increasing intra-African trade from 12% to 50% by 2045, silencing all the guns by 2020, ending terrorism, gender-based violence, illicit trade in small arms, and drug and human trafficking. It's not that we don't want all these things to happen, but they're not going to happen by being declared into existence. So let me conclude, because I'm only the discussant rather than the main speaker, by saying that though Dlamini Zuma sought to provide visionary leadership to the African Union, it is worth asking whether she may not be stalked by the ghost of Ghana's legendary Kwame Nkrumah. The lessons of Nkrumah's failed vision of a common African currency, government, and military command do not appear to have been learned. Just as Nkrumah neglected to take into account the existing political and socio-economic conditions of the 50s and 60s, I think Dlamini Zuma also failed to take into condition with Agenda 2063 the conditions that existed in her time. Only with difficulty did she finally realize that she was no longer a cabinet minister in the most industrialized state in Africa that relies for aid on less than 1% of its GDP. She was now leading a multilateral institution which actually depended for 50% of its budget and 95% of spending in the security area on external donors. Dlamini Zuma's alchemic approach in Agenda 2063 appeared to replicate some of the worst habits of the OAU, in seeking to legislate its desires into existence. However, Dlamini Zuma's tenure was not without successes. Under her leadership, the AU Peace and Security Council continued to be active and was one of the more effective bodies engaging with the UN Security Council. Gender issues were prioritized and moved, and there were some administrative and management reforms, though not particularly transformative. But the AU Commission still continues to struggle 15 years after its birth. NEPAD clearly lacks the resources and capacity to develop the continent. The Pan-African Parliament remains largely a talk shop, while the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council has failed to actually engage civil society effectively. In short, despite Dlamini Zuma's efforts, the AU was not transformed in any fundamental way in her 4 years in office. While she continued to utter visionary spells and wave a magic wand, Agenda 2063 will surely be remembered as the most illusory symbol of her alchemy at the AU, and I actually nicknamed her the alchemist. This was a magical, mystical world of diplomatic marabouts, fetishes, and incantations. Thank you.
Sorry, am I getting this technology right? Yeah.
Yes.
No, thanks. As I predicted, Chris will throw in many provocative ideas.
Chris?
Ade. But look, both the speaker and the respondent have raised key fundamental challenges, actually. And I think as you respond, I think we have to accept that I don't want to, in fact, I must disagree with Ade, that Mbeki was a foreign minister and Nkosazana was just an implementer. That doesn't even begin to come to grips of how foreign policy is made. Of course, Mbeki had a much better grasp of international relations because he's been in exile for many years and worked in that field. But he was part of a team that helped formulate policy. And the issue of DRC, Zimbabwe, and Sudan was not a problem with Nkosazana. Under Mandela and Mbeki, they dealt with many of these issues as presidential issues, and therefore did not fall within the direct ambit of foreign affairs. But I do believe that Nkosazana was not just an implementer, she was part of a contributor to how policies evolved. But it was the most difficult time. It's not DRC, Zimbabwe, it was Libya, it was Iraq, it was Iran. It was the whole period of the introduction of the African Renaissance, NEPAD, APRM. So I don't think we could have expected the new emerging democracy to really succeed in everything. But I want to believe that within the limitations, we did make a major contribution through Madiba, the Mbeki presidency, in many of the African challenges. I want to also agree that our positions were never anti-West. In fact, throughout that period, our relations with the major governments, including the Bush administration, were not bad. But we were very critical of their militaristic approach to diplomacy in many of the countries. And therefore, when we discuss that period, we have to then contextualize why you could not but criticize, not publicly, because in the diplomatic channels, the American and indeed the French and some other European Union countries' foreign policies. So it was also then therefore that I hope you will add to it, especially your experts on foreign policy. And I want to say that Justice Malala's quote that Nkosazana was President Zuma in a duke, it's not correct. Nkosazana was facing the realities of the most unprecedented factionalism within the ANC. And you either joined one or the other side, or you're in the wilderness. And for better or worse, she was contesting Cyril, and so she joined what was called the Premier League. I think she should have distanced herself more from President Zuma. She was too, her personality was, I don't know why she took that aggressive stand, but as you explain it, try to discuss it, just try to give us certain insights into that so how too the author and the discussion can. Carrie, I'm fascinated that you mentioned Nasrec. I think Nasrec, as you said, has to be very well studied. I mean, it was Mabuza's role at the end and the whole way it unfolded. It was no policies were discussed at Nasrec. No. It was the reason why after 94, you moved from just an elective conference when there was no policy discussed. Everybody just concentrated on elections to two conferences. One was a policy conference where you discuss policies. And then the elective conference where you endorse what the policy conference had proposed, but you really concentrated on elections. Unfortunately, Nasrec was worse. There was, compared to any other conference, there was very little policy discussions. It was all about the elections. I want to ask both and the audience, the mantra that is driving the ANC now, including the new administration, is unity in renewal and renewal. Can you have unity that is unprincipled? Or must unity be based on certain values, etc.? And can you have renewal if you don't fundamentally deal with the root causes of the crisis that we have been experiencing in the ANC since the unbanning of the ANC? Because unless we begin to understand the root causes, I don't think the new administration, with all his intentions, is going to be able to create the conditions for genuine renewal of the African National Congress and indeed of dealing with the challenges we face in the country as a whole. So finally, Carrie, for me it's been interesting, and Ade mentioned, I'm sure you tried to interview people and you do say that there were some people who were scared, reluctant, but I think there is a lot of information available in the archives, not written in the papers and that. And I think when you move more from the journalistic approach to book, which you had to do, to a more deeper analytical approach of South Africa's foreign policy, it might be a good idea to interview many of the people and also go to DIRCO to look at the archives. And so I think you both have thrown up a lot of issues for discussions. And I want to throw it open to the audience. Please be like both the speaker and Professor Adebayo, frank in putting your views. We are facing a very challenging time in the history of our nation. And it is clear, if we don't get things right now, we will reach a tipping point in this country. And the question of the Agenda 2063 and all that, we can also raise whether 50 years is a framework on which you can plan for the future. I think the AU, when Nkosazana got there, South Africa's foreign policy was at its weakest. And so her weaknesses, to some extent, would have reflected the weaknesses of the South African foreign policy formulation. And it also reflected a time when leadership in Africa generally, including South Africa, has reached its most, I think, difficult period in terms of quality of leadership.
You mean its lowest point?
Yes, I think that's a reality. Africa as a whole, in terms of leadership, reached its lowest point. We had gone through a very exciting period post-independence. Then we had a retreat on neo-colonialism, etc. Then we went through a period when, by sheer luck, there were 4 presidents, let's say 5, who constitute not a cabal, but who drove the progressive agenda in Africa. And that was Obasanjo, Bouteflika, Meles, Mbeki. Yeah, they constituted the core. I think that heydays ended very quickly. And since then, we have been dealing with Africa, the African leadership that's weak, the AU restructuring, the Kagame report is still floating out there with many weaknesses. And so these are all the challenges that I pose to both the speakers. And I hope in your questions, you raise these issues so that we can take on board what your views are, because we can't allow Africa to go through another period. The so-called economists starts with we are a lost continent and suddenly discovers we are now the continent that's rising, and now many countries are saying we're the only unexploited continent. Well, my fear is when you're unexploited, you will be exploited, not to the detriment of Africa. So I throw it open to you. Okay. Okay. When you speak, can you just give your name and? Yeah.
My name is Kamagelo Ledwaba, and my question is to the author. I recently read a book by Dr. Dlamini. Dr. Dlamini. And in the book, she emphasizes how 51% of the population are women, but only 4% of that population of women actually occupy executive positions. So my question to you, as a woman and a journalist, how do women begin to break the glass ceiling to occupy these executive spaces, which are occupied currently by men, mostly? Thank you.
Oh, thanks. My name is Lucas. Maybe it won't be a question, it will be more of a comment. You see, Nkosazana Zuma, a mistake is we're mentioning Nazareth. When you go to election, you need someone powerful, behind you. Mbeki, for him to win and beat the present president, Cyril, by then, it was because Winnie Mandela was behind him. You see? So those are the things that, you need. And one thing about Winnie Mandela, I hear this thing, okay, is fine. Women, they need to be assisted by men to no ways. Winnie can make FNB Stadium full by calling, a meeting within an hour. She doesn't need any man to assist her. Few calls, FNB Stadium will be full. Why? Because now her capabilities are so unbelievable. That is why you see, even now when she started, not to sing eye to eye with him big. Now people say, you see this in big. Even men and women, not only men. Men and women, they start distancing themselves from him big. You got that? So especially to ANC, if now we can start having such women of Winnie's caliber, women wouldn't be like, say, oh, these men, they must give us an opportunity. Because even in the very same conference, 70% are women. Women, they can say, okay, it's fine. You will be a president, you will be a deputy president, you will be, let's leave this 30% men. No man will ever win. But the thing is, even women themselves, they don't have confidence to those women that happens to be there at that particular point. You see, so this thing of patriarchy and everything, I don't buy it. Because in each and every meeting that we happen to meet, whether, you find that, 70% minimum, it's women. And if they can all agree, I'm telling you, top 6 or the whole 86, it can be women. So if now, women, they should start to believe in themselves and in each other exactly. You got what I'm saying? Because now you will find that, I said, women themselves saying, no, we can't have her. As, we prefer this one. As I'm telling you, we need women, we must start to have calibers like Winnie's. That, on her own, she doesn't need to beg anyone. Any man that needs to succeed, she needs to be closer to Winnie. I'm telling you, in that conference, if we said it's a Cyril versus Winnie Mandela, you wouldn't have seen it. You will be out before it even starts. You see, so that's what we need. Women, you don't need favors from men to take you anywhere. And one thing about Nkosazana Zuma, she's very firm, believe you me. She's a decision maker. She doesn't dilly-dally. She's a decision maker. If she said, that is why even you mentioned about the Gumede thing, she will take a decision like yesterday. But the thing, she's not charismatic and so forth and so forth. That's a problem. She's not, but the thing is, she's one of the women that, she will take a decision within 2 minutes. I said, this is the decision I'm taking, and then it will be implemented. Thanks.
My name is Mokgweetsi Kikabile. I'm coming from UJ PASMA. It's a Pan-Africanist organization. It's not a question. Maybe my question will come in what I'm about to add. It's more of a comment. In the society we currently live in, we need to recognize that there is the issue of patriarchy that is at play. Because what happened was that when colonialists arrive in this Africa, you can argue and say you don't know patriarchy in Africa, but there's always been patriarchy, you know? You must go and investigate furthermore. So the issue in South African politics is that even other women did not support each other going to this conference. Who would forget how Lindiwe Sisulu was bashed by the very same ANC Women's League? You know, hypocrisy coming where genuine solidarity is supposed to come, and they decide to step away from this. So it's not about women who are not capable to lead. Naledi Pandwa is more than tried, tested. She can become a president of this country. But the problem is that the women don't even have confidence in themselves. That is why there was that mess, Lindiwe Sisulu, going to the conference. Anyway, I'm not there. I just want clarity on something that you said, as we are the respondent. You said the ANC had a non-racist policy. I don't know what is a non-racist policy. Can you please assist us here? Because it was something you left hanging. Fortunately, yesterday, we were just commemorating 40-year anniversary of Robert Mangali Sosobukwe, the defier of the undefiable. I think he was the only prisoner in South Africa during apartheid. That's why even if you want to go to Robben Island, they will show you the cell of Mandela, you can take a selfie, but you can't see that of Sobukwe. It's still defied. His voice remains hidden. He once said, we believe in only one race, the human race, and this race must come after some sacrifices or after liberation. It's something that is not going to come before. Fortunately, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma could have had this when she was a member of SASO, because she was conscientized by the black consciousness. But I'm not a sympathizer of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, because she's a person who sold out on a historical mission. We have never wanted to go to fit in this system that was exploitative to other people, where there's exploitation from one human to another. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma should have known better, because he's coming from SASO, which galvanized and organized to create a more just society. You know? So can you please clarify me on what do you mean by non-racist policy? Because I reject this thing of multiracialism. I go for non-racialism. Non-racialism, it's whereby the issue of race is insignificant in society. Whereas multiracialism, it's whereby racism, as Sobuko once said, it becomes multiplied. It manifests itself from people like Penny Sparrow, from this MP, from DA, so on and so forth. So what is this non-racist policy you are talking about? Because even this Freedom Charter itself of the ANC does not talk about this. When you're an academic, when you use this, be cognizant. Thank you.
Look,
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fiso. I'm a first year politics and IR student. My question is to you, Prof. You spoke of Nkosazana having to distance herself going into the conference in December from Jacob Zuma because of everything that is surrounding President Jacob Zuma at the time. Do you not think that the media and the general public would have labeled that as a ploy to gain sympathy from the public and to gain sympathy from certain business people who had the power and indeed the ability to influence the results of the conference in December? Thank you.
okay, Excellency from Algeria. Will you first take the responses and then you can come in? Or you want to come in first? Okay. Before you come to the, yeah, if you want. But you should be, you're a struggle person. Can't you speak loud?
As a diplomat, I cannot talk on domestic policy, but would like to give testimony about Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and her mission at the head of the Commission of the African Union. I would like to say that many things that I read and I heard on her contribution as the chairperson of the Commission of the African Union was almost wrong. I have a good experience with the African Union because I had the chance to serve during the period of the OAU in Addis Ababa at the end of the 80s. I was a deputy of the ambassador of Algeria in Addis Ababa at the end of the 80s. At that time, it was the OAU and the chief executive of the organization, we call him, because there were only men, Secretary General of the Organization of the African Unity. After that, I come back to Addis Ababa as ambassador during the period of the African Union, and I had the possibility to be in Addis when Dr. Jan Ping was chairperson of the EU Commission and Dr. Dlamini Zuma as chairperson of the EU Commission. First, as a person, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, as a woman, she forced the respect with her charisma. All people, all countries respected her. This is a testimony. She was firm. She fulfilled her role as the chairperson of the AU Commission in very good conditions. Why I talked about OAU and AU, it means I have the experience of the chief executives of this organization. She was consequent with her convictions and ideas, including the matter of the gender issue. She promoted females in posts of responsibilities. She contributed a lot to this Agenda 2063. An organization such the African Union needs that kind of program. needs, even if it will not be achieved or realized, but an organization like AU of 55 countries needs to have a kind of long-term goals, objective, and targets. All the organizations, regional organizations that succeeded in the history of the mankind, and we give, for the AU, we often give the example of the European Union. There was an ideal. What happens before the agenda? Every summit, after that it became every year, we have what we call the main theme. Youth, tourism, trade. There was no coherence. You have so many themes, but not put in a coherence, in a strategy. And the Agenda 2063 put all the various aspects. If you look at this agenda, not a single subject is excluded. Everything is inside. And this is very, very important to bring all the Africans, all the African countries together. About the conflicts, I don't agree. When we said that Dr. Dlamini Zuma didn't do this in that crisis or conflict, how she did that. No, you have a machine, a heavy machine. All the issues of peace and security, the real boss of the African Union is the PSC, Peace and Security Council. You can be the most powerful chairperson of the AU Commission. A group of countries could do exactly the contrary of you want. We should see what Dr. Dlamini Zuma did in a strategic vision and perception. I talked about the Agenda 2063. You have this doctrine of Dr. Dlamini Zuma reflected in her action as the chairperson of the EU Commission. For example, African solution to African problems. She did a lot on that. But we have to accept that we as Africans, when we deal with the African problems, we are not the only people on the scene. You understand me? Yes. About financing, I should testify that one of the strongest push made by a chairperson of the AU Commission towards solving this problem of financing, it was taken under Dr. Dlamini Zuma. She pushed for the automatic contribution on the basis of a percentage of imports and so on and so on. The last thing, because it is the most important, and I never heard anyone talking on that. And this is very, very important. When we talk about a continental organization representing Africa, the balance of powers in the world, the mutual respect. You exist because you are respected. During the mandate, plus some time, of Dr. Dlamini Zuma, the progress made in what we call the strategic partnerships of the African Union. It was huge. I served in this organization when we were discussing or negotiating with foreign partners. They refused. They started discussing with us. We say, no, we refuse this. For example, because one country imposed its dictate, we were talking about Africa, European Union, Africa, this. It's unbelievable. And now, when Dr. Dlamini Zuma left the AU Commission, we talk about African Union, European Union.
Thanks.
This is very, very important. And I think that I should stop here. Yes. What I would like to say that what Dr. Dlamini Zuma brought as contribution in strategic aspects, dynamics, is very, very important. And one of the most important dynamics is that one, for strategic partnership, including with the Security Council and the Peace and Security Council of the AU. And I thank you very much.
Thanks. Carrie, maybe you should go up.
But yeah, I think very interesting issues are brought up, and thank you to the ambassador for giving us some information and insight. I think if I do write the Mark Gefisser version of her biography, and I take 8 years to do it, then I would love to sit down for a long interview with the ambassador. But that's the kind of issues I worked with. Prof was talking about sort of insight into AU, her performance in the AU. And people were either glowing or they were completely sort of dismissive of her role. And it was very hard to say. Some people say, they were negative. People are negative about her because she was fighting corruption in the AU. So a lot of officials spoke very negatively because they lost their jobs or because their contracts were cancelled. And some people say it's because of patriarchy that she had negative rap in the AU. So it's very difficult to really assess her performance. And I think once I've done more interviews in my next version of the book, which may or may not come, but that kind of insight is very interesting. As to the question on what women do to break the glass ceiling, that's the kind of stuff I'm interested in. And that's why I guess I wrote the book. I'm interested in women in power and seeing how we go about this. And it's true. I mean, even if you look at South Africa, we've got this the ANC's got this 50-50 rule in Parliament. And I do think quotas are helpful. I do think quotas are a good thing because there's role models, it brings women into this. But for women to make a real contribution, in the ANC, for instance, there are no women chairpersons of provinces. And how do we do that? And I think I've got some very radical ideas. We can maybe go and sit and cook up a sisterhood there. But I mean, the fact that women have to raise children, it speaks to the very social fabric that women raise children so they don't have time to sit. I mean, these men, when they sit and they talk about politics, I get sometimes in the middle of the night, these guys sit there in lobbies and then they send you SMSs and women can't do that because they have to put children to bed or they have to cook or whatever. So I do think it would take a radical overhaul of society and the meaning of power and stuff like childcare. And I do think women are there. I just don't think we're using it properly. And the women's lobby as well, for instance. I mean, the ANC Women's League was kind of considered to be the women's lobby in Nasrec. And yeah, I don't hold them in high regard. And I mean, somebody mentioned Sisulu, Lindiwe Sisulu, the fact that she didn't make it. I think it's the same problem that KwaZulu-Natal had in Nasrec. They were so divided and they had 3 candidates and none of them made it. So I think perhaps the women's lobby needs some more unity as well. I'm not sure which other... And patriarchy, I do think patriarchy is real. I do differ. I think it's a system. It's a system of brotherhood in the same way that when we're talking about white privilege and whiteness being a system that we need to change. Patriarchy, I think is, it would require a lot more work than we're doing now. I'm not sure if there's anything else that I needed to directly respond to. Perhaps it's Egypt. Interesting comment from a prof in Egypt. Just yesterday, I was speaking to I shouldn't reveal my sources. I was speaking to someone. It was off the record, but they said, but Egypt was apparently very angry at Dlamini Zuma for this, which kind of demonstrates. I do think the book isn't perfect and a lot of things were left out, but that is because there were 3 months to write the book. And some people didn't even answer their phones when you called them or didn't respond to their messages. but hopefully there will be another version, longer, more insightful.
Okay, thank you very much, Carien. And I think you should all buy the book because it is part of South Africa's history. And I think you can tell the story of South Africa through some of the biographies of those figures. I think on patriarchy, maybe the two men actually demonstrated the continuing power of patriarchy, because they almost seem to be blaming the victims in their interventions. And I don't think that someone like Winnie is such a straightforward figure. I think there's a lot of complexity when it comes to talking about Winnie Mandela. She definitely has her role in terms of the struggle, but there are also things like Stumpy and other things that have made her, let's say, her legacy more complicated. So I wouldn't revere her in the way that you have. And we also need to look at facts. I mean, if there's only Jessie Duarte in the top 6, we can't say women need to try harder or have more confidence in themselves. Or if they're mostly men occupying the most important ministry, we can't say that it's because women don't have confidence in themselves. These are choices that are being made. So I think it's important to realize it's not only in South Africa. We also had some of the same things. I referred to the American case, where there was also a lot of misogyny or prejudice against Hillary Clinton in the elections that Trump won. So that happens, and it's something that actually needs to be recognized, not denied. I think in terms of the non-sexism, it goes back to or non-racism, sorry, it goes back to the history of the ANC. I think you admitted whites in the 1970s, right? Into the ANC, into the organization, Aziz. Yeah, late 60s. So it basically talked to an issue of equality. And the ANC, unlike the PAC, saw itself as an organization that was open to all races and was pushing for the equality of those races. Now, it's not a matter of whether I agree with it or not. This is what the policies were when the ANC changed itself in the late 60s to admit whites into its membership. That was what it was promoting. So you don't have to agree with me, but that's actually what the organization decided on. The last question, Chair, was I didn't completely get your question, comrade, on the role of the media and whether if she had not distanced, or if she had distanced herself from Jacob Zuma, then she would have been punished for it. I think, as Ispahad said, it's the way that you do it also. Maybe she didn't have a choice but to use the network, but you have to, I think, play the game a bit more subtly, and to be seen as somebody that was hanging on his coattails and dependent on him basically opened her up to the kind of comments that Justice Malala made, that there's basically no difference between Jacob Zuma and Dlamini Zuma. But the one thing I do want to say about the media in closing is that what I observed about this campaign, and I think Carien hinted at it, is that the media stopped being a referee. It took off its jersey and actually put it on CR7 and was basically playing on one side. And I think that's something that needs to be investigated, because the alleged sex scandal was actually more or less brushed aside by most of the media. And you wouldn't get that in any mature society. In fact, in any mature society, Marikana would have finished off Cyril. So I think we need to at least have more of these in-depth analysis in terms of how the media has actually played its role.
Thanks a lot, Prof. How much time do we still? Oh, sorry. Sorry, thanks a lot. Well, I've been instructed that we have to close at 7. Advise, no, instruct. Colleagues, I'm sure there's many more questions you want to ask. But obviously, originally we were going to end at 6:30. It's now getting to 7. And I would like to thank both Carien and Prof for throwing out many ideas. Carien has already agreed she's going to do a second book. And this time she's going to be doing a lot of interviews and a lot of research. She's not going to depend on the media. And I think that that's not a bad idea, Carien. I think writing over this period, which is the most exciting and challenging period of all levels of our democracy, to write it in 3 months is very brave, actually. But you did a good job, given that situation, actually. No, I mean, you did a good job. And so, thanks, Carien, and thanks, Prof, as usual. You like to hear us saying you talk to power. Well, you weren't talking to power. Today you're talking to Carien, one of us. But thanks for your insights, and thanks to the audience, and I hope the next discussion is on the South Africa-Nigeria relations. I think that's vital, because without good South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Kenya, and 1 or 2 other countries, the hope for an African renewal is wishful thinking. So, hope to see you at the next discussion. I'll be sitting there with you and asking the Prof and the discussant some of the questions that have been worrying me a lot about what has happened to the South African-Nigeria relations. So thank you and good night.